My name's Kendra Freka, and I have been a clinician at Children's Health Council. It'll be 19 years in August, so it's always interesting to me when I work with some of the kids here because I look at them and I go, wow, I've been working here longer than you've been alive, which is a strange concept for me. And I've been really fortunate to work in a lot of different divisions of the agency, and so I always feel really proud when I'm able to do parent eds and can kind of speak to those different services we offer here. How many of you have ever had services or done parent eds here before? A few of you, okay. So some of you have already heard the spiel probably or know a lot about our agency. And those of you who haven't, welcome. One of the things that I think we do really well is our community education. And my favorite part about it is that it's at no cost to parents. And we have a variety of speakers that come and talk about different things. So please look through the brochure. And if there are some that you think about for the future, come back and join us. We try and get different speakers. I usually speak once or twice a year, but we get outside speakers too, as well as clinicians from the agency that come in and talk. One thing I'm going to remind you at the beginning and the end is there is a survey on your seat, and after the presentation, it's really helpful for you to fill that out. And the best part of filling out the survey is that it guides us and what our future offerings are going to be for the community. So if there's something specific that you want to see or that you would like us to provide for you, that's your place to really give feedback. And it also helps with the funding. We get fundraising for community ed, and that's why it's free to the community. And so we really want to make sure that the people who are funding it know what the responses are of what we're doing as well. I will answer questions throughout. I tend to talk fairly fast. So if I'm talking too fast, tell me to slow down. If I know we're going to talk about something in a future slide, then I may say, oh, we're going to get to that. My biggest goal when I do parent eds, I want everybody to leave with at least one strategy that you can try at home. So something that you haven't done before, something you didn't know before, so that you walk away feeling like you learned at least one thing. I hope you learned more than one, but at least one. And I'm always happy to answer questions, and I think one of my strengths is I give really practical suggestions. So I tend to go through the slides a little bit quicker, only because I like to get to the end when you guys can ask questions specific to your child or about a situation that you might be having, okay? All right, so I talked a little bit about Children's Health Council and my experience here. We serve 0 to 23, so those of you who didn't know that, we serve a wide range of kids and students here. We have 2 schools on site. We have one school, Sandhill School, which is for kids with learning-based differences, and in particular specialize in dyslexia. And then we also have Esther B. Clark School, which is a school for kids that have more emotional challenges. In the center, we do assessment and treatment. We do occupational therapy, speech and language work, psychology, psychiatry. We're really well known for our team evaluations. So again, if there are other services that you're interested, there are resources on the table and in your packet, and the care manager is a great person who can answer questions about more of our services at CHC. And you have this in your packet, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. Again, talks about the different integration of an effective learner, our areas of expertise, ADHD, learning differences, anxiety and depression, and autism. Our 4 divisions are our clinical services, our community connections, Sandhill School, and Esther B. Clark. And one of our newer resources that we have started to really tap into is services for our trans, bi, gay youth. And we have a lot of community partners. We've had, I don't know if anybody was here for the transgender panel that was here a few weeks ago. But again, a really nice resource for community opportunities in our public parent education as well. So it's not always just us that's speaking from CHC, it's also members from the community. So today we want to talk about defining ADHD, managing difficult behaviors, behavioral strategies to promote attention, defining executive functioning, and strategies to promote executive functioning, social skills training, and then other interventions. As I mentioned before, some of you came. My biggest goal is that everybody leaves with at least one strategy that they didn't have before they came. How many of you already have a medical diagnosis of ADHD for your child? How many of you have had your school say they think your child has ADHD, or you received an IEP for attention issues? Okay. Do you guys understand the difference between the two? Okay, so I've got some yes, some no. So some of you are like, been around the block, we've gone through this all before. People who are new, it can be really daunting. Some pediatricians will give the diagnosis, and there isn't a formal evaluation. They may do some screeners where they have you fill out some parent behavior checklists. The school may do the same thing. And frequently, people who work with kids in an academic setting might be more likely to see some of those attention difficulties because the kids are there for a longer period of time. They have to transition to different activities. They have to sustain attention in a seat for a longer period of time, and the demands are greater. The difference is that school districts, unless they do a formal assessment by a school psychologist, cannot give you the diagnosis of ADHD. It has to be done from either a medical professional or a mental health worker. They can say your child has attention issues and you can get a 504 or an IEP, and usually those are geared more, the IEPs in particular, it doesn't have the category of ADHD. So people, if they come in and say, my child has ADHD, I need an IEP, that alone doesn't allow you access to special education. You have to go through the full assessment to see if there are impairments, and that's one of the things we talk about in the diagnosis. Most kids with ADHD end up getting qualified under other health impairment, so they still can get services, but it's not specific to ADHD, where some of the other categories for education, autism is one of them. There's also health impairments like blind or hearing. They're very specific to the diagnosis. It's the same with other mental health disorders too. If somebody has anxiety or depression, you don't get an IEP just for the anxiety depression. You might get it for an emotional disturbance instead that interferes with their learning. So defining ADHD. There's two broad clusters. One is problems with attention and distractibility, problems with impulsivity and hyperactivity, and they must be present in at least two settings. Some symptoms must be present before age 12, must be causing the impairment. Or I'm sorry, must be causing an impairment. So the age 12 is an interesting one. I heard this from other parents who have, I think it was PAMP, I don't think it was Kaiser. They were talking about how somehow age 12 seems to be this magic number for services. And it's similar with kids on the autism spectrum. It doesn't mean that you cannot be diagnosed with this later, but it would be highly unlikely that somebody with ADHD would not have any symptoms before age 12 because it's a pervasive problem that they have. You might be able to cope with it better and have some strategies where it's not an impairment, but the symptoms would likely be present. So to get the diagnosis, you really have to have 6 or more symptoms for 6 months or longer. And I look at these and I think, well, doesn't this describe a lot of kids, right? Careless, poor sustained attention, doesn't listen, not following through, avoids disliked tasks requiring sustained attention, can't organize, loses important items, easily distracted, or forgetful in daily activities. This also sounds like a lot of adults I know sometimes too. So when we get to the section on executive functioning, you're going to see how these symptoms really wreak havoc for our kids, especially when we start to get more long-term assignments. I'm curious because I often get a broad range of parents with kids of different ages. So how many of you have kids in elementary school? Okay, and then how many of you have middle schoolers? How many of you have high schoolers? I was gonna say, if you raise your hand again, you've got like the trifecta then, right? Some of the strategies that we're going to talk about will work well across ages. Others you might say, well, that seems too elementary for my kid if it's an older kid. So again, when we get to the Q&A, try and think about how you would generalize some of the strategies for older kids, but also ask me specific questions of what you would do for children of different ages, whether it's really young or really old. So hyperactivity, impulsivity, squirms and fidgets, can't stay seated, runs, climbs too much, can't play, work quietly, on the go, driven, talks excessively, impulsivity, blurts out answers, can't wait and turn, intrudes or interrupts. One of the things that I often think about when I see kids that have ADHD that's not medicated or haven't been diagnosed or treated as they get older, you start to feel like it's more like dealing with a toddler, because there's so much of those skills that they're doing that are things that you feel like you're teaching at an early age with kids at that kind of early developmental age. And yet they're expected to be able to know where's your inside voice, where's your outside voice, what your body's supposed to be like in one situation and the other. The other thing that I have really seen an increase in is with the more that we see kids on electronic devices, you see a hyper focus when they're on the electronic device, where they're kind of in the zone, they are hyper focused, have a difficult time transitioning, but once they're off of it, the irritability and the inattention almost seems to be worse at times. And so I have some parents that'll come to me and they'll say, oh, my kid doesn't have problems attending. He can play a game or he can build Legos forever. So you have to remember too that sometimes that novel task of what their preferred interest is, they're going to be able to sustain that attention longer. With video games in particular, you always have input coming in. So it's not like you're sitting there doing something that is boring. There's always some kind of stimuli coming into their neurons. So ADHD subcategories, and again, the DSM-5 is the mental health category. So when I talked about diagnosed by a doctor or a mental health professional, it's a book that basically says these criteria equal this result. If it's unclear, if we're not sure, then we usually do more extensive psychological testing, or we might do more rating scales like I talked about. The child behavior checklist is a big one. The Connors is another one. So predominantly hyperactive and impulsive presentation, largely diagnosed in preschoolers. Why do you think it's largely diagnosed in preschoolers?
Running all over.
Exactly, right? How many preschoolers do you know that sit well, right? I mean, that's what you're learning in preschool and kindergarten is kind of circle time and sharing and all of those social skills. Predominantly inattentive presentation, often diagnosed relatively late, between 10 to 12. And that's because it's not externalizing, right? The impulsivity and hyperactivity is something that annoys us a little bit more. When we have somebody who's quiet or internalizing, that's something that sometimes we don't notice as easily. Combined presentation, typically diagnosed in first or second grade. Other common challenges in ADHD, social immaturity, difficulty making friends, tendency to hyperfocus on preferred activities, emotional volatility, difficulty controlling anger, graphomotor challenges. So when you look at this, I want to give you a different framework for a second.
What's graphomotor? Sorry.
It's the writing.
Oh.
Yeah. So if I said to you, these are challenges that somebody with anxiety has, or somebody who has depression might have, would it surprise you that they're very similar, that they overlap? So what's difficult when we have kids that have challenges is there's often multiple things happening at once, and so it's hard to know, does my kid have ADHD? Do they have a learning difficulty? Do they have an expressive language problem or a sensory integration issue? Because all of those things might make me irritable or frustrated. They might impair my ability to develop friendships, my ability to focus, right? If I'm anxious or depressed and I've got a lot of internal thinking going on, it can really impact my ability to focus. So sometimes that's where the additional assessment comes in. Other times it's really clear. It's like, no, my kid has lots of friends. They do great. They just can't sit still and they can't focus or they can't complete tasks, or their backpack's a mess or their desk is a mess, right? The brain schematic of ADHD shows that the decision zone is all in the prefrontal cortex. So where the executive functioning is, and the motor cortex is near the back, but the first part talks about where, and I hope you can see that, networks flow through the prefrontal cortex, and ADHD drugs operate in this area. So part of what we're looking at when people say, well, why is medication the primary intervention for ADHD? You can always do behavioral interventions first, which I always recommend, but the studies have shown time and time again that medication and behavioral intervention or medication alone yield the best results. And part of that is because it's a neurological problem that goes with the frontal cortex. And so when you're able to slow down and actually use those skills, it can be really helpful for kids. Yes?
Can
Just one question. You said that a lot of these things overlap. We're at the beginning of our diagnosis. Where how do they relate to autism? Some of the ADHD, anxiety, or
Right.
sensory integration.
Right.
How does it? Because all of that is similar to also autism.
It is. And so especially high functioning autism, you will have attention issues, you will have some obsessive issues, you will have some rigidity. Every kid looks differently, and there is often overlap. The one thing I would tell you is frequently the strategies that they use or the interventions are going to work well regardless of what the disability is, because it's the symptoms that we're looking at and trying to remediate. It's important to know long term the learning differences and the other needs, because I don't want to make the impression that ADHD is the same as autism, but it is very similar in that you will see symptoms that overlap, and often some of the remediation would be the same. And when I say that, in terms of social skills, in terms of impulse control or relaxation or anxiety, those interventions are going to be the same when you look at the specific symptoms.
Medication. I know anxiety is symptom versus ADHD.
So if I have a kid that's on the autism spectrum and somebody says, well, there isn't medication for autism, there might be medication that would help them with reducing their anxiety or in helping them attend. So again, it's not curing autism, but it's reducing those symptoms, hopefully, depending on what that person's symptoms are that are interfering with another domain. It could be that I have a diagnosis, but I function well and nobody knows that I have that diagnosis or have that challenge. So it really has more to do with what are the skills that they have, and so we're looking at building skills when we talk about the behavioral strategies. Yeah.
With an ADHD diagnosis, would you expect to see working memory scores of average or below average, or could they still be high?
That's a great question. I often defer for testing to the psychologist, because as a social worker, I don't do the testing. It wouldn't surprise me that you could see both. I think commonly you see lower working memory, but I don't know that that's, I feel like I always try and take each kid individually.
So you look at the whole picture.
Yeah.
Like the average. But
Right. And if you look at those 6 symptoms too, you could have those 6 symptoms and none of those talked about working memory, right? Mm-hmm. So you could still have the diagnosis and you could have a test that would look differently.
I have a question.
Okay, hold on one second. So the baseline comorbidities is kind of what I was speaking to before. It talks about ADHD is seldom seen alone. Often we see mood issues, tic, anxiety, sometimes oppositional defiant. One thing I would say though, in particular as kids get older, that impulsivity is less tolerated. So as you start to have more impulsive behaviors that get you in trouble, especially as you get to middle school and high school, if you're doing things that might be seen as harassing or you're doing things with poor boundaries, we have more and more consequences for those types of behaviors. And so you start to see, I would say, parents getting frustrated, but also teachers saying like, oh, it's a behavior problem or other things, when they're sometimes just not understanding the neurological needs and challenges for some of the ADHD kids. Okay, question?
Yeah, so let's say let's say a kid gets diagnosed by ADHD very young, like around 4 or 5 years old.
Yes.
Can the behavioral strategies help that kid and without any medicine? Is it possible, or the early diagnosis doesn't help at all?
Right. So there is never an exact answer to any of these questions. But what I would tell you is it the behavioral strategies that are helping, or is it maturation? Because part of what we also see is that as kids get older, they start to navigate things a little bit better. I still may have a lot of energy, and I still may kind of blurt out answers and things like that, right? But I might start catching myself quicker, or I might have a teacher who does great strategies in the classrooms, and so it's not a problem as much in that person's classroom. The next year I go to a different class, and I have a different environment, different structure, and you may see a spike in behavioral challenges or a spike in other things. There are plenty of kids and adults who've gone their whole life and not had any medication. There's some adults that get medication as adults because they realized they were undiagnosed as kids. So I don't want to give the message that everybody should go and put their kid on medication either. There's a lot of other interventions that you can do. But it's important just to know the research and what the research shows that it is beneficial. And the other thing I would say is if you're misdiagnosed with ADHD, then you're going to be playing kind of a roundabout game of is this medication, because usually stimulants are the primary intervention, and some kids don't respond to stimulants. So it just depends on your individual child too. I would say if there's a family history of ADHD or attention issues, same thing with anxiety and depression, there's a higher likelihood that a child might also have it if their parent or immediate family members have it. And if their parent responded to medication, then the child may also respond well to medication. But again, each kid's different, but that's kind of what the studies show. Parenting interventions. Parenting interventions can be effective in reducing externalizing behavior problems. Can be done in individual or group setting. Examples of group settings would be the Incredible Years and Triple P. These are both evidence-based parenting programs that show good efficacy. Monitor and target problematic behaviors, set clear and developmentally appropriate expectations for behavior, positive reinforcements for appropriate behavior, praise and reward, negative consequences for unwanted behavior, ignoring timeouts, privilege removal. So, I have an ADHD kid. Is my goal for him to sit still? No. My goal is for him to learn how to manage his emotional regulation when everybody else is sitting still, right? So if we're thinking in terms of goals, the goal can't be something that an ADHD child might not be able to do. We can give them things that help them sit still, but be realistic. If I know my kid isn't going to be able to sit still for a long period of time, make sure that you've got breaks set up either at school or at home. Not the kind of breaks where I then get distracted and wander all over the place, but short breaks, maybe something that is sensory based so that they can get their body moving and then get back to what they need to do. I used to have a rule when I would do in-home consulting for kids that got really distracted. You have routines and rules for homework time as well. So having a desk without a lot of other stuff on it, having everything they need there so they don't have to go find paper or pencils or other things. And if they need a break, it's a very short break where it's go to the bathroom or get a snack or stretch and you go back. Not to be militant, but as soon as they wander away, there's too many things, and then you start the power struggle of, okay, I need the book back or put the toy away. And so having that routine where they know the expectations can really help set you up for success in those kind of settings. Sample curriculum for parenting, positive attending skills and praise, catch them being good, ignore attention-seeking behaviors within reason, using timeouts and privilege removal for noncompliance and rule violation, avoiding power struggles, and utilizing behavior charts or token economy effectively. How many of you have used any kind of behavior chart or token economy? Did you find that it worked?
For a while.
For a while, okay. Any others? Yes, no? So if, I'm curious, the one for a while, can I ask you directly? Okay. Sure. What was the reward?
So he had to cash in like physical tokens to get his screen time. Yeah.
And how often did he get the physical tokens?
So there was a set in the morning routine, there was a set for coming home from school, and then the screen time was after that.
Okay. And did you do it so that each token earned minute times for screen, or you had to get so many to even get any screens?
You had to cash in 15 tokens.
Okay. And so that didn't have to be consecutively, just as soon as you got 15?
No, you could only do it at 4 o'clock.
Got it. Yeah. And if I only have 10, I can't do it. Oh, but what if I have 14?
So, good question. So I had it set up so that if you do everything, you get it. And then sometimes I would be a bit more lenient. I would be like, add a task that you need them. Like, can you clean the table or something? Okay. So there was some inconsistency there. Yeah. Okay. Usually he had enough. Okay. He had enough because maybe we just didn't do it for whatever reason, and then we weren't home or whatever, and then he would have extra.
So I earn my screen time, and how long do I get it for?
30 minutes.
Okay, so my game though, Mom, it's gonna take me 35 minutes.
Give a timer.
I know, but I just need to really finish this game. Just one more time, Mom. Come on. No, I can't get off right now, Mom. I can't. Okay. Mom, why'd you turn off my thing? So now I have a tantrum. What do you do?
I don't really say anything. at that. We've been through different things. We went through a period where they had to do the pledge before they got on. That I promised, I may have to stop at an inconvenient time, but I promise not to take it out on my mom, my dad, or.
I love that. Everybody write that one down.
So that helps deal with all that stuff.
Because the expectation is set ahead of time.
Yeah.
And you haven't told them, they've owned it by doing the pledge.
Yeah.
This is what I frequently get when we do behavior charts, though, is people will say it creates more problems, it's more of a power struggle, and our kids are really, really, really good at finding loopholes. So if there's any way to wiggle around it, they're gonna find that way. So I tend to write out the rules, not too long, but a couple basic rules when I do behavior charts. I will also be pretty clear, like, you like screen time, but if this becomes a problem, this isn't going to be able to be your reward. The other thing is, if you have a kid with an addictive behavior problem with screens where they cannot get off of them, you don't want to make that the reward. So you want to think of other things that you can do. What are other examples of rewards people have used? Yeah.
Getting a new stuffy.
Okay.
Kids love stuff.
Mm-hmm. Any other ones?
Ice cream.
Ice cream, okay. So I'm going to tell you my example that I often give kids and parents. It doesn't help you guys really because I think kids are negotiating, right? And so I'll be in sessions and I'll say, so some of the things on your chart are safety, right? It might be keeping your hands and feet to yourself, using property for its intended purpose, could be bedtime routines, things like that, right? So I always say, gosh, you know what? There's a mall right across the street, and there's a crosswalk there. And I walk across the street every day for lunch. I press the button, the light turns green, and I go. Nobody stands on the other side of that light and gives me money or ice cream or anything for doing that. That seems really unfair. I should totally get something for crossing the street the right way and doing it the way the law tells me to do it, right? So part of what we want to also instill with our kids is that part of why we practice these things and learn these things is because it's what's expected in society. And so we certainly want to motivate them. And that's part of why I ask, how long does it take to get the tokens? Or when do you get the tokens? I have some family, they're like, there is no electronics during the week. It's only on the weekend. So they can cash in on the weekend. So you have an impulsive kid with limited attention and you're getting these tokens and you have to wait all the way till Saturday to cash in. And for some kids, they're stoked. They're looking at their tokens. They're like, yeah, look, I've got all these tokens. They're excited about that. Other kids, it's too long to wait. So I'm not saying give them electronics during the week, but there needs to be something that's going to be reinforcing and motivating for them or they lose their motivation. If you get to that 14 and I don't get what I want, you can also see kids saying like, well, why did I even try? I did all of this work and I didn't get it. So sometimes I will do each token is worth a certain number of minutes. So you still get the minutes, but it has to do with how many tokens you got, and then there's more motivation to do that. I also, if a kid has a safety issue, I will tell them you cannot cash in on a day when you have been unsafe. And so that's a day that we need to, you still earn it, you didn't lose what you got, but you can't cash in on that day. It would have to be a different day.
I also remember the other thing I do is sometimes I'll just catch him being good. So on days when I know he's being short, I'll catch him being good with his sister or something.
Good. And that's important too because we want to reinforce. Now if I just say, here's your token, you were good, does he know what he did? And I'm not saying you did that, but I'm just giving that example for everybody else.
No, we do like, here's one for combing your hair. Here's one, like we try to identify it and we have a list on the fridge.
Okay, so specific praise is really important. It's the same thing I tell parents when you say to your kid, go clean your room. That's not being specific enough. You need to say, put your laundry in the laundry basket, put your books on the shelf. Now, if I have problems with my working memory and you just give me 5 directions, am I gonna remember those? No, chances are I'm probably gonna remember the last one you gave me and I'm gonna go do that one, or I'm gonna do them out of order. So lists with checklists are really, really important, but also being able to kind of encourage them and say, okay, go throw all your laundry in the basket and I'm gonna go check on that and then I'll check the next one. And so you kind of do it one by one so they feel success too. Because usually they feel like it's too big of a project, it's too much, I need help. I also will tell my daughter, I'll tell her, I'm happy to help, but I can't help until you start because I'm not gonna do all the work. So if you can go start, I'll go help. Stress model, I show this to all of the families I work with and all of the kids I work with. It was originally something that I received in a de-escalation training that had more to do with aggression. But if you think in terms of regulation and stress, it's really important to look at how we respond in those situations. So we're really thinking about kind of a fight or flight response. So you have your baseline behavior. For ADHD kids, how many of you have two kids, one ADHD kid and one non-ADHD kid? So big difference in their baselines, right? So I kind of give the example that ADHD kids often, unless they're inattentive, but the ones with hyperactivity and impulsivity usually rev higher, right? If you can think about a car and they've got their throttle going, right? So the other car's just kind of nicely rumbling and then they're vroom, vroom. So their baseline is going to be different. So don't give false expectations of wanting them to be calm when that's not how they rev, right? They may never get to that kind of calm. We can certainly teach them relaxation and self-soothing skills, but they may not be somebody who's normally at kind of a resting place. As you get stress, frustration, maybe you're moving too fast and you're dropping things, you're forgetting things, you're losing things, the stress starts to move up. I frequently will use a 1 to 5 scale and talk about 4 and 5 being the danger zone, and that 5 is really when you're out of control, you're really feeling like you're losing it. So when you think of tantrums, I think of those as like the 4 and the 5. If I'm sad or internalizing, it may be when I'm shutting down and just not able to do anything. So if I'm doing my homework and I'm overwhelmed and I just stop and I'm not talking, that could be a 4 and a 5 for that particular kid too. So when we're stressed, as we go up, it's going to look like that, and that's kind of our crisis moment at the top. Our cognition, this is our problem solving and our cognition. And so what happens is we are not problem solving well. We are not thinking through things. And if you think of yourself, not even a child with a disability, but yourself, a pretty high functioning adult, right? If you get in an argument with somebody, sometimes we feel ourselves tensing up, right? We might start to think in our head, oh man, here we go again. You know, you're trying to like go through the argument, or you're trying to get your getting out strategy, or you're thinking about what you want to say. But as you get stressed, you're not thinking about those things anymore, right? So if you think in terms of a fight with a stranger, you're going to be way more stressed, right? With a loved one, maybe not, depending on the topic, right? Child rearing, maybe, I don't know. But our problem solving really is diminished at that point. And what do we tend to do with our kids when they've done something really bad or really unexpected or super impulsive? Usually we say, why did you do that, right? And I don't know why we think that they're just going to say, well, Mom, I was walking down the street and I decided to pick up something off the ground. I mean, they're not going to calmly tell you most likely in that moment. Maybe later after the fact they would, but what we do is we start to get frustrated and then we move away from baseline. And then our problem solving starts to diminish. And that's frequently when you see the power struggles. So often in those moments is when parents over consequent. It might be, okay, now you're grounded for the day. Now you're grounded for the week. Now you've lost your iPad, you've lost your bike, you've lost ever leaving the house again. And we can't sustain those, but it's also not showing good problem solving skills for our kids. So frequently in those moments, we have to kind of take that deep breath and say, let's just calm down right now. And I can't tell you how many parents say, but then you've given in or then they've won. And you really have to think about, no, you're helping them get back to baseline. And so if you can use those terms like we have to be calm before we can talk about it, use very few words with them during that moment. And they may say, why aren't you listening to me, Mom? They may chase you around, right? Or Dad, sorry. But keep in mind that the more calm you can be, and distraction is a great tool at this time. So that's the caregiver's escalation that it looks like. And I would tell you, teachers have this same pattern. So if your kid is a kid who is really challenging to teach because they're always moving, always doing things, a teacher is going to be more likely to become stressed, and their problem solving may go down in those moments. There's some teachers that are really calm and that doesn't happen. But you will also find that kids get sent to the office more. And I talk about reinforcement and the negative reinforcement. If I have a kid who's really disruptive in my class and I send him out and my class is peaceful, I've now negatively reinforced that situation because I got rid of, and not to call your kid an aversive, but I've gotten rid of the thing that's kind of bothering me. So I will be more likely to send them to the office more frequently because it worked. So now my class is peaceful again, instead of working through those moments and coming up with strategies in the moment. So if you start to see where your kid is getting sent to the office a lot, or you're feeling more frustration from the teacher, try and really think in terms of, okay, how do we work with the teacher to better understand so they're not feeling stressed and my kid's not feeling stressed at the same time, because most likely it's more of a power struggle. Exercise a self-control plan. How do you react to your child's problem behavior? Create a concrete plan for regaining immediate self-control. Simple, specific, usable. Identify methods for restoring your balance immediately after work and as a lifestyle. Use self-care, and remember you're modeling for your child. So I'll be the first to admit that I have not been proud of my parenting moments, my bad mommy moments, when I've been really frustrated and done something where I've either raised my voice or said something I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And I would say that the times I've done that, it has always made the situation worse. If we're running late and someone's distracted and like we got to get out of the house, even if I use checklists and everything else, we get to that moment where it's like, we just got to go. We've got to go now. This is the time. There's no more. Get your shoes on in the car. Get your clothes on in the car. I don't care. Go to school in your pajamas. We need to go now. And then they feel that tension. They're not problem solving well, and it takes longer. So if you can take those deep breaths in those moments and just kind of try and find your inner peace, you will find that usually it keeps the kid calm and you're able to work through those moments quicker too. More about parenting interventions. Consistency between caregivers is key. And this is important if you have extended care or babysitters or nannies regularly too, because if you have certain routines for bedtime and other things, you want to make sure everybody's following the same routine and using the same language. I'm going to tell you that, and then I'm going to tell you that it is really, really, really important, whether your kid has ADHD, anxiety, or anything else, to not just teach the routine, because life is not predictable. So you have to be able to say, what's our plan B? If this doesn't work, what do we do? So you want that predictability of what our schedule is going to be like, but you also don't want to create kids that are really rigid. So I have some kids that are very specific about the food they eat, and they'll say, I only eat this brand of chicken nuggets from this place. And if it's not there, then they have these meltdowns and say, no, I'm not going to do it. So including that variety is important. You don't want it to be different every day when it comes to timing and scheduling, but maybe you're changing your variety, like the toothpaste you buy or things like that, the pajamas. And some of our kids have a lot of sensory issues. How many of your kids have sensory issues? Okay. So one thing that is also really important for our ADHD kids who also have sensory issues is to either consult at school with an occupational therapist to see if there are strategies that can help them sustain their attention in school that have to do with sensory integration, or look into getting an evaluation or do a screener. And often there's now, I feel like you can get anything online, but online screeners that can help you see, is this an area of concern? Is this an area that's significant that interferes with your child? And frequently they can recommend sensory diets. When I first heard sensory diet, I thought it was certain food you were supposed to eat. But it's not. It's activities that you do that help with the joint pressure. So a lot of kids with ADHD do better when it's deep pressure or heavy work. So frequently we'll say, go get your energy out, but sometimes that revs kids up more. So it's important to know which your child responds better to. And you'll know, because you'll know, nope, if I do these certain things, they're winding up, not winding down. So consistency between parents and teachers is also crucial. Clinicians provide support but are not the primary agents of change. Along with parenting interventions, concurrent classroom management is recommended. Let's pause for reality check. What we should do: ignore minor behaviors, be patient, be present, reinforce appropriate behaviors. What we can do: tell them to knock it off. I'm so exhausted. There are so many other things on my mind. Ignore or not notice because they're just doing what they should be doing. So we may feel like doing some of these, and I know for me, I go home and my way to unwind is sometimes like checking messages on my phone or doing things like that. And I have to be mindful about when I'm being inattentive, when I've kind of checked out or been distracted. And so recognizing that sometimes your kids haven't seen you all day, and if you walk in the door, they want that time with you, and helping them understand that you may need your downtime. You may need, 5, 10, half an hour to kind of unwind. We joke at my house that you're comfy cozies. We go home and put on our comfy cozies. So my husband will already tell her, like, don't talk to mom until she has her comfy cozies on. And so she knows, like, oh, she needs a few minutes to relax. But making sure that that's part of what you schedule in is that one-to-one time with kids. And that's really hard when we have overscheduled families and kids or multiple kids and you're trying to give all of them attention. But that one-on-one time really helps from seeing other behavior problems where they're trying to get your attention in a way that might not be pro-social. So behavior strategies to promote attention. Verbal prompts. When you finish dinner, remember to put your dishes in the sink. So when I give my verbal prompt, where should I be? Should I be in the other room saying, hey, put your dish in the sink? And then when they don't listen, are you listening to me? How come you haven't put your dish in the sink? That is probably the biggest challenge that I think families face when I talk to them about, well, how are you giving the direction? So if I'm a kid with attention issues, I may not only need to see you, I might need you to put some kids are tactile sensitive, so you don't want to do that, but you might need to get their attention and say, hey, and have them actually look at you and say, can you please go do this? And that's important that when you're giving a direction for it to be effective, that you want to make sure you've got the child's attention. The other thing I would tell you, and I've given this example before, it's one of the favorite ones I've learned. I wish I remembered who was speaking that told me this one, but it really sunk in with me. When you are at a school, how do you know when recess is over? What do they do at your kids? Bell rings. Some people, they blow whistles, right? There's first whistle, first bell, second bell. So we get one bell that means stop or recess is over, and then the second one says go line up. When we give a direction to our kids, how many times do we give it to an ADHD kid? I'm a broken record. I've given it over and over and over again. So now I want you to use the same example as the bell. And I want you to think, if that bell rang all day or like for 5 minutes straight, what would the kid do? They wouldn't know which one to respond to, right? Because it's happening over and over and over again. So we're actually we're not shaping that behavior by giving too many prompts and cues. We're just kind of flooding them with reminders. And so being really clear, like, one, not doing it from the other room, doing it in front of them, getting their attention, but then also making sure that they're moving and kind of saying, come on, how do you get that behavior momentum? Do I say, here, you bring one, I'll bring one, those kinds of things. And it takes a lot of hand-holding, but eventually it becomes a routine for kids and they start to remember a little bit more the more that they do it. Visual cues, daily schedule of morning routine, and after school schedule with pictures illustrating activities if needed. One thing I would tell you is that visual cues, in my opinion, are going to help your child the most long term. Why do you think I say that? Any guesses? What happens in middle school and high school?
Have to be more self-directed.
More self-directed, and there's more to manage. I now have multiple classes, multiple teachers, multiple assignments. And so being able to have either a schedule that kind of you write down your journals, and a lot of schools do that. A lot of schools do work on the executive functioning. What I find with my ADHD kids and my kids with learning differences is that they will open up their planner and there's nothing in it. And so they get home and you're like, what do you have for homework tonight? And there's nothing written in there. And so making sure that the teachers are helping build that routine, that they're signing off on what's supposed to be in there. A lot of schools have moved to the virtual assignments, which is great, but who usually checks those virtual kind of pages? The parents. They go on and they say, oh, your teacher says you have this for homework or you have that for homework. So making sure that your kid is responsible for their routine. If you're helping them do it, that you're not doing it for them. So I've had kids that are a little bit older where they have to log on and they have to go to the teacher website. And sometimes we just have a checklist of what do you do first. So if your homework's not in the folder, you can call a friend, you can email your teacher, you can check the website. But it's helping them build those problem-solving skills with your support so then they get in the habit of knowing what to do as you do it more and more. I've had some middle school teachers, they're like, well, by middle school, they should know how to do this. And it's like, if they don't know it now, it still needs to be an accommodation where the teacher checks daily. The other problem I see is that often teachers say, well, we want it in the folder for their assignment, right, or their class. So if you have 7 classes and you've got 7 pieces of homework and you have to put it away in 7, it sounds like, oh, well, that would be really organized. For some kids, we just need the to do and done. And so they know anything that's to do for homework goes in the to do folder and anything that's done goes in the done. So if the teacher then says, turn in your homework, and we still have kids with these routines where you think every day the bin's right there, they know to turn it in and they forget. And so how do you use the visual cues to help them remember? And maybe it's something on the top of their or binder that says, remember to turn in your homework, or remember to do this, so that they're always being reminded of what step they need to take, and then being reinforced by the teacher or the parent. My kids in middle and high school, though, really the ones who have tutors, I would say this is one where they still, even on their breakfast mat, will have like the schedule for the day or different things just to help keep them organized. Schedules. Create a schedule posted in a relevant location so they are prepared for routines and transitions. Focus on one routine to start. Include a reasonable number of steps appropriate to age. Routines happen all the time, and they're different than schedules. When I think about early elementary school, we learn pretty quickly, you put your backpack or your jacket on a hook, right? Or you go to your desk, you know what different things you get out for different assignments. Same kind of thing at home, of having those routines can be really helpful in learning new skills and maintaining those skills at home. So if you don't have a routine, if you're somebody who's not very organized yourself, or you just don't, you're like, I'm not really stressing about the routine. If you have a kid with difficulty with organization, a routine's gonna really help them. And so you may have to kind of practice your own routine too to support them, because if you're disorganized, it'll make it really, really difficult for them. So this is an example of a visual schedule. You know how our kids can get dressed in 10 minutes just like that and eat breakfast. I feel like, you know, all of these things sometimes happen the last 15 minutes of the day before you're out the door because they've done something else to distract them before that. So if I know that my kid likes to read, what should I do with their books?
Take them out of the room.
Yeah, so when you have your morning routine or even bathroom routine, don't put books, if books are a distraction, around where you need them to do things because you want them to be focused. I've heard parents say this, and I can totally appreciate it. You can take everything away from my kid, and they'd find a piece of lint on the floor and find something to do with it, right? So I think that's really creative. It's a great skill our kids have. But it's also reminding them. Time timers. One of the ones I've used recently is just my phone one, because you can set so many. I will set multiple ones, not to overwhelm, but to say the first one is the reminder that you need to be dressed, or this one is for this one. And it also helps keep me on track, because then I'm like, oh, okay, we're at this point now, we need to keep moving and move along and see if I need to help out. This one's just a visual example of the same thing. There are so many different apps for doing things, so many different resources. I feel like now that there's digital cameras, you can take pictures of so many different things to help kids learn different things. But for me, some of the kids like the tactile. So if you can say, okay, I've made my bed, now I put it in the done sheet, that can sometimes help them engage more, because it's the physical act of doing it versus just checking it off.
Sorry, what is that? That's online or it's on the wall?
This one is on the wall, but what they've done is they've just printed up different pictures, and then I think those are magnets, and they just put it from there into the done pile. I know Melissa and Doug have one that is kind of nice too, that's just a responsibility chart, but it also has things that are more character developing things too. So it might be keep hands and feet to myself. It could be make my bed. And then they have some blank ones where you can write in your own goal. One thing I would tell you, which I'm sure you all probably already know, being good, being safe, I wouldn't put those on a goal chart. You need to be more specific, and it has to be something that's attainable. So I might say if a kid has problems hitting or kicking or body space issues, I might say keep your hands and feet to yourself. I try and phrase them positively. If I see a chart, a reward chart that says don't hit, don't do this, you want to tell them what you want them to do, not what you don't want them to do. So I tend to phrase things like if I'm, and again, some of my ADHD kids are really, that I work with, are really creative. So they can make experiments out of just about anything in your house, right? So it's like using property for its intended purpose, asking permission before you do something. Those are all ones that can be helpful. Strategies in the home, lists step-by-step directions regarding what they should do when they get home in the afternoon. Audio cues, set tones on personal devices, phone, watch, timer. What prompts your child to ask himself, was I paying attention? I also would say, if any of you have used a time timer before, those can be really nice because it visually shows the passing of time, especially for younger kids. Some kids get really anxious with timers. So if you have like an egg timer and it's getting closer, they will spend more time focusing on the timer and how much time they have than actually doing what you want them to do. So that's where sometimes I don't even have it nearby. It just goes off and it's like, okay, I need to start cleaning up. Take movement breaks, create routines and options for breaks that allow a child to recharge. There is a website, but I know there's multiple things. Go Noodle, have any of you heard of Go Noodle? They have all sorts of different movement breaks types of things. I don't know if I brought it in, but we did a yoga mindfulness parent ed not too long ago, and it should still be in our resource library. It was done by Jennifer Hector, and it had all sorts of really cool mindfulness apps and movement apps for kids. And there's more and more integration of this in the classrooms, of teachers taking these movement breaks where they'll have kids stretch, but also where they're using smart boards or other things to kind of show quick video clips so kids can kind of follow along. And it makes it more fun for the kids too. As kids get older, I've had a lot of kids that like the Calm app, and a lot of it is, some kids are like, it's too boring. But white noise machines, all of those things can help in relaxation. Have any of you used weighted blankets? So weighted blankets are another one. Sometimes it just can kind of give that deep pressure that kids really like. I always equate a weighted blanket to like going to the dentist when you get the lead vest. I love that. Like I go and I just feel like it just kind of melts me in, where some people feel kind of claustrophobic or like pinned down. So some kids are not going to like that and other kids will. Behavior charts, use concrete achievable goals with desirable rewards. Start simple and be specific. Choose a few behaviors rather than all. Behavior should be concrete and specific. So my background is behavioral in nature. I used to be the behavior management department head here, and I did consultation at schools creating behavior intervention plans. So one of the things that's not included in this that I think is still important to note, even though we're talking about more of the neurological factors with ADHD, when you're looking at behavior, behavior serves a purpose for kids. So the neurological part, we feel more like, well, sometimes can my kid control it because it's the way that they're processing information, or it's that frontal cortex that we talked about. But if I am getting reinforced where math is hard, and if I get silly and goof around, I get out of doing math, then we want to come up with other things that are going to meet that same purpose. So it might be using a take a break card, and how do you use that? It might be a movement break. Working with the team is going to be really important. One of the things that I always found really frustrating in either working with parents or school staff was if they said, this kid's just manipulative, or this kid's just disruptive. Because there's a negative image of kind of the child versus what their challenges and their needs are. And I would have to tell you that every kid I've ever worked with has some kind of strength and something that you can leverage in an academic setting or in a home setting. So thinking in terms of when we want to change behavior, you have to replace it with something else, a different skill or something else that is pro-social. So again, I can't just say, my goal might be I want my kid to sit longer, but I have to give him something that's going to allow them to do that. And if I need sensory input, I can't just say, just sit there, right? So some of the things that we've talked about in the past are fidgets. What's the problem with some fidgets? Very distracting, right? So especially ones that make noise, if you're using them in class, sometimes they become toys. So I always tell kids, it's not a toy, it's not a distractor. If it becomes that, then it gets taken away. One of the ones that I thought was really cool that somebody used in a school, and again, it depends on your kid and what they like the feel of, but you can get that double-sided tape, and they had a Velcro thing in there. Now you're thinking, Velcro, that's really loud, that would be really annoying in class. They didn't add the second side to it. So all the kid would do is rub his finger over the scratchy side, and that was enough to give him that sensory input that helped him kind of ground himself and focus. Other times there's like worry stones you can use, things on key rings that you can add to them too. If your kid is one who tosses things, don't give them something they can toss. They're just going to get it taken away. And so try and think of ones that would work well for your child. Putting charts on their desk when they're laminated, the kids will pick and play with those, but just know you're going to laminate it again and it's going to keep working. Child must feel good and goals are achievable. Collaborate with your child to make sure rewards are relevant and motivating and reasonable to your budget. Work with the clinician to problem solve. I always worry when I hear a parent say something like, oh, well, if you get your behavior goal, we can go to Great America this weekend, or we can have a party. You can't sustain those kind of, well, maybe you can, but I don't know that you should, so sustain those kind of rewards for kids. And again, we want it to be intrinsic. We want them to feel good about using self-control or regulation strategies. It's not in here, but there used to be one called How Does Your Engine Run? And it had more to do with using metaphors to compare your body to a car. Do you have the fuel you need? Did you get the rest you need? Are you running hot? Are you running cold? So it was allowing kids to start having insight about what their body feels like when they're dysregulated, what it feels like when I'm inattentive. And so they can be more aware and kind of work harder to focus or to take a break if they need a break. Now the zones of regulation is the one that many people use. It's color coded, and it again talks about like red is when you're revving too high or you're having kind of dysregulation. Yellow's like you might be in the middle of that, and then green's calm. But that's another tool that I frequently will encourage parents to use. Just because you're using a tool that a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist used doesn't mean your child necessarily needs speech or OT, but there's lots of strategies that I would recommend for typically developing kids as well. So this is another example of a token economy behavior chart. Just so you know, this is my trigger. I don't like smiley faces, and I'll tell you why. When I used to do data collection, I would come in and I'd be at a school meeting and they would say, so he has 15 smiley faces. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, what does that mean? And it's like, well, they had 20 before, now they have 15. I'm like, okay, but what does that mean? I do better with raw data. So if you convert your smiley faces into numbers, it helps to know, okay, so 2 times out of the week, 2 out of 7 times, I was able to ask for help when I'm mad and I would not hit, kick, or yell. Why do I think that that's important versus the total? How do I know if my chart's working? It should be working if you see a decrease in the frequency of a negative behavior or the increase in a positive behavior. So your goal is that you want negative behaviors to happen less frequent, you want them to be less intense, and you want them to be shorter in duration. So if I don't have any data on that, I'm not going to be able to do this. So what frequently happens is we don't fill out our behavior charts. So if you're going to use a chart, be consistent with it. And don't make it too hard. For some kids, if I keep using hitting, and that's probably not the greatest example, but what if I interrupt? And you're trying to decrease interruption or make an awareness about interrupting, right? Or you want them to turn off the TV or the electronics when you ask them to, instead of having to ask over and over again. That might happen. I might interrupt 20 times a day. So I have to know how many times my kid's interrupting and then say, well, am I really only going to give them the smiley face if they don't interrupt at all? Is that reasonable? Because what you're trying to do is shape that behavior. So as you're shaping it, you might make the goal a little higher where it's like, okay, you've got 5 interruptions today, and then we're going to slowly make it lower and lower. If you're not setting them up for success, they're going to give up. It's going to be too hard, and we're giving them expectations that are really challenging for them. I often hear parents say, but they can do it at school, so why can't they do it at home? Any theories on why that might be? How many of your kids are on medication? When does the medication typically wear off?
When they get home.
Yeah, you want them to go to sleep at some point, right? So sometimes there's short acting and people will use it through homework time, right? Other times you got to get that homework in right when they get home or you're starting to fade. The kids who are not on medication have spent the whole day keeping it together or trying to keep it together, reading social cues, sitting through demands, trying to sustain their attention. I saw something online that I thought was a great example, and they talked about inattention. And if you think about being in an office and you're on a WebEx or a conference call and you're trying to listen to the person and someone comes to your door and starts talking to you and the phone's ringing and you've got emails coming in and then there's a fire alarm. All of those things happening at the same time is frequently what it's like for a kid with attention issues because they can't filter those different inputs. They're just being flooded all of the time with information. And so if I'm giving you a direction and they're just seeing and hearing all these other things, it's not surprising that their working memory is going to be challenged and that they're not going to remember all the steps. And that's where the visuals can help. The visuals also really help with parents because it decreases the likelihood you're going to get in a power struggle if you can just say, let's look at your checklist. Did you do number 1? Okay, go do number 1, right? And then they finish that one. Okay, did you do number 2? But if I'm having to repeat it all the time, I can just keep going back to the checklist instead of having to verbally give them directions. So time for another reality check. Sometimes these strategies will work beautifully, sometimes they won't, sometimes we'll revert to our old ways. Be patient with your child and yourself, practice self-care, seek rest and support when you need it. Brain rewiring takes time and practice. It will get easier. Defining executive functioning. Executive functioning skills allow, and this is, how many of you have heard of executive functioning before? I was going to say it's a very big buzzword. It's been, I'd say, I feel like I started hearing it around 10 years ago, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. Allows us to organize our behavior over time and override immediate demands in favor of long-term goals. Do tasks on time in an efficient way. Enable us to manage our emotions and monitor our thoughts in order to work more efficiently and effectively. Choose what to say and do. I don't know why I just thought of this when I was doing this, though. How many of you have kids that are working on computers now where they can type on the computer at all? So font is the worst thing in the world for our kids with attention issues. They will change the font and the size over and over again. So certain things like that, if you can set the rules ahead of time, you can only use this font, you can only use this size, it helps a little bit, but it's so tempting. So they're probably going to be distracted by that. Again, I think a great invention would be to have one that doesn't change, so they just have to use one thing, because it's a time waster, and that's one of the big things. So often when we're talking with kids, it'll be like, okay, if you have this amount of time, how much time do you have to format? Or let's format at the end once you finish what you're doing. Metacognition, the ability to monitor performance and self-manage tasks. Planning, organization, time management, working memory, and monitoring. We've been doing a lot of mindfulness at CHC, especially with our teen groups for distress tolerance. And one of the things we talk about is really focusing on doing one thing at a time, not trying to do too many things, because we often worry about the future, we worry about the past, and we're not present in the moment. And when I think about our kids with attention issues, they've got a lot going on, and so being in the moment is really, really hard for them. But when you can practice some of those mindfulness skills, it can really help them in that way. I feel like, at least with my generation, I grew up thinking in terms of I can multitask really well. So if you're multitasking really well, are you really focusing on one thing and doing it from beginning to end? So one of the things, and I heard someone else talk in this term when they were talking about, I think it was Dr. Korb from Developing Minds. I feel like he gave the example of your kids need to be a closer. So frequently they'll start something and they don't finish it. So one of the things we really want to work on them with is how to be a closer, how to finish what they start. And again, if it's something that's a struggle, I know for me that's a struggle with me sometimes. I'll start one thing and my husband goes, wait, you started this and now you're over here. And so really trying to be aware when it's a challenge for you and how you're going to model it for your child as well. And if it's not a challenge for you, how do you tolerate a kid who really struggles with that when it's important to you? You know, I think that's one of the times I've really seen struggles with parents, when we've got a parent who's super organized or likes things in a very controlled way, the same all the time, and our ADHD kids kind of come in like a whirlwind and makes it really hard for them and their personalities. Behavior regulation, the ability to shift behavior, change thinking, and modulate emotions using appropriate inhibitory control. Inhibition, shifting and flexibility, sustaining attention, and emotional control. Strategies to promote executive functioning. Focus is on the concepts of providing external structures and support, kind of what we talked about a little bit before when you're thinking about the visual reminders. Deficits are presumed to be the result of frontal lobe immaturity. Metacognition and behavioral regulation are underdeveloped in children with ADHD. Solutions come primarily from adults. Compensating for EF deficits, externalize important information at key points of performance, the working memory, externalize rules and time periods related to tasks, break up future tasks into many small steps, externalize sources of motivation, externalize mental problem solving. When they talk about externalizing mental problem solving, if you think in terms of graphic organizers or webs, it's helping to organize lots of information. If you think in terms of long-term planning, how do you think especially when our kids start getting research papers, how do you break down the different steps they're going to need to do so that it's one at a time versus looking at the whole, because that's really hard for them. And often our kids also don't see the interrelatedness. They have a hard time seeing how a piece pertains to the whole. So if I do note cards, I've had so many kids who have such a hard time taking the note cards and writing an essay because they don't see how it goes with the same thing. And it's really like, no, you're doing the step that then creates the bigger project. Externalizing working memory, use external information to remind the individual what is to be done at the point of performance, sticky notes, cue cards, lists, posters, signs, and other prompts of critical reminders. I can't tell you how many middle school and high schoolers I tried to do calendars with or schedules with, and they'd be like, no, I have a system. And I'm like, okay, so what's your system? And they would like pull out little pieces of paper or different things. I'm like, how do you remember, like, what if you lose that? And so and my question to them is it working? Is it effective for you? Are you getting done what you need to do? And if they were, I said, okay, you have something that's working for you. So even though I want it organized and I want it this way and I think this would be more helpful for you, if what they have is working and it's something that they've kind of taken on as theirs, it may be effective because they created it. But it may not be the most efficient thing either. So when you're trying to do these things, remember that if you keep pushing it, especially from a parent's perspective, kids will often reject it because it's not their idea. So if you can engage them in the collaborative problem solving, that would be really, really helpful. For older individuals, use personal journals, digital recording devices, watch reminders, day planners, personal organizers, and computer organizers. A lot of the schools don't allow for phones on campus, but I've had parents put in the accommodations in special ed, either 504s or IEPs, that they can take pictures of the homework, because often our kids, especially with the graphomotor, have a difficulty tracking from the board to their agendas. And so being able to get a snapshot of it so that they have the notes, and that way they don't have to handwrite them, especially if they're slow. I've had some kids that are like, I'm taking notes, and by the time I get the first word down, they're on to the next thing, which can be really frustrating as well. Externalizing rules and time, make your expectations concrete, clear, consistent. Post rules on posters. Child restates rules at each activity. Make time physical, external, and obvious. Again, timers, watches, digital clocks, anything else that can signal the passing of time. I have done this because my daughter she knows a little bit of time, but I'll say when that show is over, or it's about the same length as a show, or about the same length as a game, or when you finish the book, right? And a lot of times that's because then there's an end point. So you kind of know, like, once that's done, you're done. There was something on here. I've had a lot of parents that say they know the rules. We tell them the rules every day. They know the routine. They tell them to them every day. Just keep in mind that there's all that external stimuli and filtering that they need to do, so the more it can be in one place, the more it helps them organize their thinking. Breaking down tasks, break larger projects into smaller tasks, use visual aids, use outlines to organize information, apply these principles to schoolwork, home, and everyday tasks. This is one example of a graphic organizer. I actually find this one a little busy, but it is geared for essay writing. I like the ones that are bubbles with one thought bubble and then they go off from there. And it's going to drive me nuts. I can't think of it right now. Do you guys use any programs for graphic organizers at your school that you recommend? I think it's Imagination. Does that sound? Inspiration is one of the ones that a lot of schools use. And it's really nice for kids that have a hard time with writing activities and kind of organizing their thinking. It gives you a concrete way to visually organize your thinking. The other thing that I have used with kids before is if you say, write about your favorite movie or write about a trip, they get confused because they're like, well, how do I pick my favorite? Like, how am I going to do that? So if it's something where they could distract themselves over and over, have specific topics, and you put them on like the tongue depressors or something else, and you just pull them out. You say, this is one you're going to write about today. I also think giving kids multisensory opportunities to tell stories. So if they can verbally do it, if they can draw it, giving them other ways. It doesn't mean they still can't practice their writing and need to learn how to write, but you don't want to turn off our kids from academia because we're making them do stuff that isn't fun for them. So giving them a fun way to do it is really important, and that plays to their strengths. Externalizing motivation, identify tasks and settings in which consequences are too delayed or non-existent. Shorten delay if possible. Work towards positive motivators. Focus on positive rewards rather than negative consequences. And that's a big one. I think when we're frustrated, we tend to be more consequenting and punishing versus thinking in terms of when you can do this, you earn this. And a lot of them are logical. I think it was Christmas time when I told my daughter that there'd be no presents coming in if there wasn't a place to put them. And so it was trying to figure out how to clean her room because there was no room for anything else. Yeah. Well, we started, she started like saying, what are we going to get rid of before something else can come in? And so now she's in the habit of doing that a little bit more. Increase accountability to others, more frequent check-ins with others to see that work is being done, goals are being met. Externalizing problem solving for tasks normally require mental problem solving, manipulating mental information, generating multiple ideas, make the mental information external or physical. For math, use manipulatives, number lines, illustrations, and pictures. For writing, brainstorm out loud, discuss ideas, use graphic organizers. Social skills training. Problematic social behaviors. Children with ADHD experience higher levels of peer rejection and social isolation. Do you feel that to be true? Yeah. Impulsivity and aggressive behaviors, general immaturity, difficulty reading cues, struggle to initiate and maintain relationships. I would say that some of my friends that I work with ADHD, my kiddos, if they've been in a school setting for a longer period of time, sometimes I feel like they have more bonded friendships because the kids grew up with them and attribute it to it's just so-and-so, that's just how he is. And it's more of an accepting kind of thing. Not always true. Sometimes it's the other way where it's like, that's so-and-so and he's so annoying. He's always been so annoying. So it's like you get a bad rap from the beginning. But I think it really comes from a culture of understanding that people have different and that they learn differently. It doesn't mean we have to say, oh, that kid's got ADHD or that kid's got anxiety or that kid's got this. But I think really helping kids be tolerant and yet still set good limits so that we're giving feedback in a way that's not just you're annoying, but it's like, hey, you're standing too close to me. Can you take a step back? And that comes from parents and teachers also doing that. Adults are very patient, usually, not always with our own kids, but usually with kids. And so you will find that kids with challenges often relate better to adults because we're more patient, and kids just don't have patience with their peers. They're like, you're annoying me, get out of here, or you keep talking about the same thing, or you're poking me. And so it can be really difficult as kids get older because we see more and more of the anxiety and the depression, especially around social settings and academics. And in this area, I've talked about this before, that it is such a high stress academic area that our kids who have learning differences and mental health challenges really feel the pressure because it's, do more, participate more in more things, which can be really great for some of our kids who need that sensory output and input. But when it gets to the academia part, it gets more and more challenging. And we have lots of kids with ADHD who do great, but it's really helping them build those skills and the support networks. And I know you guys, many of you don't have the high schoolers, but as you get to high school, it really helps too to have those evaluations with the accommodations because they can use them for college testing and they can use them often to get services in colleges as well. Social skills classes, skills training with same age peers, concrete goals such as peer group entry, conversation skills, conflict resolution, live facilitated practice with peers, provide immediate rewards and redirection, limited generalized, that's a big one, generalizability with individual therapy. I've done groups, I've done individual. The key in my mind to individual therapy is practice. So if somebody comes into my office and we practice something and they're calm, I joke that like my ADHD kids in a one-to-one session look great. They don't have a lot of distractibility because it's just me and them, right? They've got all my attention and I let them guide the play most of the time. But when you start setting limits or you have to sit for longer, usually by the end of the session I start seeing more of the behaviors, but it depends on the time of day too. It takes practice. It's like anything. And I have kids that are real big sports fans. So I'll say, there's people who are really good at stuff. Like let's think about the Warriors, right? So those are great basketball players, but they practice. They practice every day, right? So they maintain those skills. So if I'm somebody who doesn't have those skills, I need to learn those skills, and I need to be open to learning new skills, and then I have to practice them so that I use them or I'll lose them, right? So often when I hear that the generalizability of individual therapy isn't there, it's because in the moments when we're having those impulsive behaviors, it's hard to stop and think because there's so much other stimuli going on. So thinking of foreshadowing and prepping ahead of time, reminding kids what could be challenges. I call it coping ahead. So if I know I'm going to a birthday party and it's laser tag or something like that, my kid might have some problems with that, right? So thinking in terms of what are the potential pitfalls for your kid, how do you plan ahead, have a plan B, and help them navigate those before they're in that setting. Other interventions. These are more specific types of therapy for parent and child. The parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT. It's a little difficult to find clinicians who do this. It's usually for younger kids. Family therapy can often improve just the educational component of understanding your child's needs and having someone kind of walk you through some of the challenges you might be having. Individual therapy, again, for comorbid conditions like anxiety and depression. Executive functioning training and coaching. And I had mentioned to someone earlier, you have a flyer for the parent executive functioning workshop that's coming up. I think it's in March. But there's also a flyer. We've just started having our Sandhill teachers at the school where we have kids that have learning differences and dyslexia do executive functioning coaches. And there's some good teachers over there doing it. But I would recommend, if you're interested, to sign up quickly because they fill up really fast. And because it's new, there's openings right now. It's the one that looks like a present over there on the right-hand side. Additional suggestions: use immediate feedback, use rewards before punishment. I talk a lot about teachable moments, like helping in those moments of kind of giving feedback when, if they're not regulated or they're upset, that's not the time to do it. But if there's a play situation and you can kind of help them work through it, that helps. Increase frequency of praise and consequences. And remember to be specific praise. Increase accountability to others. Use meaningful rewards. Let children participate in suggesting rewards and be flexible. More helpful tips. Parent-teacher partnership is critically important to setting your child up for success. Keep in mind that the problem is chronic. Make sure goals are simple and sustainable. Anticipate problems and plan ahead. Keep a sense of priorities. Don't abruptly withdraw support and structure. Keep your sense of humor. And distraction, I mentioned that earlier. When you have a kid who's kind of away from baseline, I have to give I'm going to give him, don't tell him I did it, but I'm giving my husband props because he is the best at distracting. And I had told him when my daughter was really young, like, this is a great tool when you're getting frustrated and you're in that power struggle to just completely be like, oh, what is that over there? And you kind of, and some of the kids, they're savvy, they fall for it. So you have to think of good ones. But if you can get their mind about thinking on something else, usually you disengage in whatever kind of their tantrumy thing it was about. And he's done it so well that I will say to him, like, oh, wait, what over there? No, I don't know what that is. He's like, no, I'm distracting her. And I'm like, you distracted me too. But a lot of times it just takes the energy out of a tense situation. And I talk frequently with families, and it's something I struggle with too. If you feel the energy level going up in a situation, you're going in the wrong direction. You really need to be taking energy away from a situation, and it takes a lot of practice and patience from the parenting part too. And with our kids with a lot of energy, I'm an older parent, so my daughter is very active, and it just drains me. By the end of the day, there's some days where I'm just like, I don't have the energy to do this anymore. And yet we have to. That's our job as parents, right? So trying to figure out that balance of self-care is super important for you as parents. And it helps us be more calm and patient and understanding with our kids who are struggling, because there's nothing worse than them saying things like, I feel like I can't do anything right, or I feel like everybody's frustrated with me, or nobody wants to hang out with me. And so really trying to keep that in mind, I think, will help a lot and keep you moving forward instead of kind of getting stuck. Final reality check. Sometimes these strategies work beautifully, sometimes they won't, sometimes you revert to our old ways. Be patient with yourself. It's the same one as before. Brain rewiring takes time and practice. It will get easier. And then there's some list of resources in there, websites as well, and then questions. Any other questions? I know some of you asked questions as we went, but yes.
So when you talk about distraction, is that only for younger kids? How about for sixth grader and up? Is that still work?
Give me more specifically what the issue would be, and then I'll give you an example of how I would distract.
Oh, just today situation, my sixth grader want to go to his surprise birthday party, but I just heard about today and it started at 7:30, which is too late in the middle of the day. And then she had, it's today, and then she has volleyball practice. I said, I know you really want to go, but it's too late and how do you get there? So anyway, a big melting down, and screaming, crying, slamming door, and like melting down.
Well, first of all, let's all thank that other parent for giving the invitation and setting us up, right? In those situations, I say, gosh, I try and validate and say, I can tell you're really upset, you really don't want to. And how many of us ourselves have fear of missing out? I don't want to miss out on the party that everybody else might be going to, right? And so I usually will try and do some negotiation, like, gosh, if we'd known ahead of time, we could have gone, but I know that must be really disappointing for you. Maybe we could do a play date on another time with that friend, or maybe we could celebrate her birthday, just the two of you. And so sometimes that alone appeases them. If it's like, no, all my friends are going and I can't go, there's always going to be those moments. And then I would either,
She couldn't even hear.
yeah, so sometimes I'll turn on music. Sometimes I just sit and kind of let it go through its course. If things are getting escalated to a point where somebody is tantruming to the point of being aggressive where they might hurt you or somewhere else, that's where when they talk about behaviors to ignore, those are the ones we can't ignore. And you run this risk of, if I respond when my child is being aggressive, am I reinforcing that they know if they're aggressive, they'll get attention or they'll get what they'll want or they get out of something? And so a lot of parents are like, well, I don't want to give them what they want because then they're going to think they can use that every time. The downside of that is you have to maintain safety. And so when you think of going back to baseline and safety, it's more, how do we take some deep breaths? How do we relax? If she's at that stress model level where she's not responding, you can try and take deep breaths, but it's going to be harder. And as they get older, you've got a whole bunch of different stuff you're working on, because now you've got hormones playing into effect. You've got cognitive differences where my friends mean more to me than anything else at that time. I'm trying to separate from my parent. So your strategies are going to be more challenged anyway, because they're trying to find their own voice and their own independence. So I think sticking with your guns and kind of validating what they're saying, trying not to argue with them, giving them a solution like, hey, we could do it another night, but tonight's not going to work. And then just giving them time to kind of feel those feelings and try and move on. One thing I've talked before with people too, and some kids it's not their thing, so you don't want to give an intervention that's going to trigger a child more. Sometimes putting on music or singing a song, or even littler kids are, in my mind, easier to distract because I think there's more fun things you can do. Like I used to just tell my daughter to blow out my fingers like they were candles, and she'd be like, what? Or I'd count fingers, or I'd be like 1, 2, and I'm like, oh wait, 5, 4, and so I'd be silly, and she's like, that's not right. I'm like, well, you count them then. And so sometimes just those kinds of things can get them on. What is your daughter like? What are her interests?
What are her interests? We try to get her the interest to try everything and quit, and anything hard, and she'll quit. I get little bumps, and she just, I don't really know. She like scream, of course, I don't give it to her. We haven't found anything she's passionate about and struggle, homework, anything, posture, self-care, homework. If I ask her to do it, and a big no and scream.
Yeah.
It's just,
No,
yeah.
and I think, again, we don't feel effective in those moments, right? We start to feel like, great, nothing I'm doing is working either. And part of it is just that consistency of continuing to say, well, you got to get up and take a shower, you got to do this. And a lot of, excuse me, our kids that become more isolated, whether it's with screens or rejection from peers, it creates that pattern too, because then I'm less likely to go and want to socialize because I'm not successful, or I'm afraid I'm going to get rejected. And so then I stay home, but then I'm not interacting and I'm not getting that positive social interaction. So I don't want to do it, and it just becomes this cycle, which can be really hard. Is there another example that somebody wanted, either of distraction or a different type of situation that I can help you with? Yeah.
I have just a generic question, which is my daughter was recently diagnosed, and she's primarily presenting inattentive. And so and she also high functioning autism and some learning stuff. But I'm struggling a little bit. You said that there's a lot of overlap between high functioning autism and the ADHD, and I'm struggling a little bit where it can sometimes feel like the things I'm doing to try to help her pay attention more or focus, or like I don't know where to focus first, or if there's an either or,
Yeah.
like do I help her learn how to pay attention so that then we can work on some of these other skills, or is it more important that we focus on the like the social stuff so that she feels comfortable and happy, and like I don't know if you have experiences with that. Yeah,
It's a lot. It's a lot to take in. Have you gone through ESPA?
yeah, but we've just started.
Okay, so great resource. ESPA, ESPA, it's through Stanford, and we're a collaboration with them. We have a couple of staff on site here that do the parent coaching. You do not have to have an autism diagnosis, but it was originally founded for people who were trying to navigate new diagnosis and really struggling with services, IEP process, and kind of like what you're saying, what do we do first?
Because there's a lot of directions. The first thing you do is you get on a lot of wait lists.
Yeah.
and then you need to sort of figure out where to focus your energy. Like there's just so many possible ways to go.
Yeah, and I think people who get an autism diagnosis early on will tell you that you're frequently doing a lot at once. So often there's occupational therapy, there's speech language, there's academic remediation, there's ABA, and as much as there are a lot of services that can help, and it's early intensive intervention, which is shown to be a good outcome for younger kids with autism, it's not always diagnosed younger. And
She's great. It's not that young.
Right. She's 8. Right.
and I think that high functioning piece, that's part of it, like the inattentive part. I feel like if your kid is not loud, that sometimes those are the times that they get missed. It's never too late, but I would say just take a deep breath. And I think parents who've been through this process before, it can be really daunting. Parents Helping Parents is another really great resource, especially when you're navigating the IEP process. They have a lot of parent eds that they do as well. I even had a kid who was more severely autistic, but high enough functioning that he was in public school, and he, when he aged out, when he was graduating from high school, they had a conservatorship that his parent had looked into, but they also have a lot of transitional living programs, so how to get adult services after that. So these resources around really specialize in some of these areas, and so even though it's overwhelming, and like you said, the wait lists are incredibly long. I mean, I feel for parents because it's a grieving process when you find out your kid has challenges. It's one of those things where you start to feel like, I had these hopes and aspirations for my child, and it may be harder for them. It doesn't mean they can't reach them, but it may be harder for them. And it's harder for you as a parent. One of the parenting support groups I did a long, long time ago for ADHD, they talked about it's like planning a trip. And you're planning a trip to Paris, and you can't wait to see the Eiffel Tower and eat the food, and you're really excited. So it's like the anticipation of having a child. And then you get off of the plane and you're in Holland. And Holland's nice, and they have pretty flowers, but it's not Paris. And so it's that adjustment that you have to make to how do you appreciate what you have and what it is when you're still mourning what you wanted and what you were expecting. And it doesn't mean you don't love what you have. You just have to kind of figure out how do you speak Dutch, right? Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I can't say it's a general question, but how would a parent go about doing the second, maybe third or fourth opinions at this point? My son has been diagnosed medically with ADHD. He's also PTSD. We have a few different things going on. I have physically exhausted all efforts at this point. We are in every program possible. He has graduated and re-enrolled. He has been kicked out of school, is now in behavioral school. I've done every step I can, and I don't feel that we are moving forward at any point. I know we started this at the age of 4, and we're now going on 12 next week.
Yeah.
And I feel that I ignore the medication spectrum. I don't like it. We've tried it. Impulsivity went skyrocket out the roof, and I felt the impulsivity actions that he was taking was too much of a harm towards himself and other people, that it wasn't worth that risk. I feel that's my only option at this point. I feel like I'm being surrounded by schools and everybody else is saying you don't have a choice. That's the only thing that's going to help him. And I guess I need more opinions on, or more input on, why you guys feel medication is helpful. Because I haven't found anything that is.
It sounds like it's a really tough road that you're on. And I always appreciate family values and what you want for your child. You ultimately get to say, you know, if you put them on medication or don't put them on medication, right? One thing that's really hard with psychopharmacology is that this may work great for this whole group of kids, and your kid may be the kid that it doesn't work for. And it's really hard to use our kids when we feel like it's like a guinea pig.
That's exactly what I tell them, is when you find something that you say is going to work for Jaden, I'm all for it. But at this point, I feel like I'm putting my child on an emotional roller coaster. It's one time he's a zombie, and then the next one he is completely hyperactive. The next he is outlashing. The next he is self-harming. And it's like, I can't find the middle. I can't find the median on any of it. And it's...
So when you think about this road that you've been on that's been a struggle, and now he's in a, he is in a behavioral school. If those behaviors continue, what are you afraid of?
That he's either going to hurt himself or he's going to end up in jail.
Right. So when you weigh out, we've exhausted all other resources, right? If medication could help avoid those options, would that be worth it to you? You know, and again, I think you have to weigh that out. You know, there's not as many, but you always have kids that are predisposed to certain things too. So if there's drug histories, other things, makes us more scary for us to think about, like, do we want to put them on a drug if addiction runs in the family, right? Or what if they become addicted to that drug and then they start using other drugs, right? The scary thing about impulsive behaviors is that kids are more likely, if it goes untreated, to get in trouble with the law, to get suspended from school, to try drugs and alcohol, to do more risk-taking behaviors. And kids do that anyway. Like, let's be real, like, that happens anyway. And then you've got kids that are predisposed to that. And so supervision, being there for your kids, structuring those opportunities, having good supports, good relationships with the school. Do you have an advocate? For, like, a special ed advocate? So Stanford, and I think is my email on the, I think it's on the handout on the very front page. Email me and I'll find it for you, but Stanford has free legal services specific for kids with learning challenges, and they can go to IEP meetings. I don't know what the wait list is like, I'll be honest with that. ESPA's another great resource, because if you say, this is what I need, whether you have autism or not, they will find support groups, they'll find respite. They have just a great list of resources. Then you end up on the wait list, right? So that's the hard part.
They can diagnose your kid, fine, but then they tell you to find someone else because there's a very long wait list. And then you call your insurance company and you get an advocate, and she says, I'm still looking, but there's so many kids here, there's no doctors available.
Yeah, it's really hard. And advocates, I mean, there's different kinds. Like, some special ed advocates, some educational advocates are very expensive. So the Stanford one will do sliding scales. Some of the other ones are tough. Parents Helping Parents have some people that will help with some of that. I would look at, if you want an independent evaluation, you said, what else can I do? Have you had an independent evaluation yet? So there's also a book called Special Education Rights and Responsibilities, and it's been edited several times, but it's online, and it's geared for parents. And so if you say, how do I request special education? If you say, how do I'm in a placement that I don't agree with, or I don't think I'm getting the services I need, it's all geared in a Q&A kind of way, and then it instructs you on what you can do based on the law. And so those are things you can do on your own, but it certainly helps if you've got, I mean, I feel like the squeaky wheel, if you have somebody who's sending out legal notices saying, and again, we don't want to do this early on we want to be collaborative with our education systems, but if you're doing all that and you're feeling like you're not being heard, there's definitely resources and accountability. You can request in writing an independent educational evaluation. It's different than the one they did. They have to go with an outside agency who does another evaluation. And you can do the same thing with the behavior plan. If they don't have a behavior plan or it's not being, okay, so if they have a behavior plan but you don't agree with it or you're not seeing significant change, you can say you want an independent evaluation for the behavior intervention plan as well, okay?
Thank you very much.
Sure. Any, yes?
So my son in high school just started medication and just learning about it. Isn't it true that 2/3 of the ADHD will be, the symptom will go away or normalize
With medication?
with medication? Does it affect the
I would say yes and no. Here's the part that I would tell you. So you get medication and I can now focus, which was really helpful, right? Suddenly I'm like, wow, I'm not so distracted. I can focus on one thing now with a large majority of the kids. If I don't have executive functioning skills, I can focus, but I still don't know how to organize things, right? So it now allows you to be more able to use skills that you're learning. So I found that that's kind of the big difference is that, and the part about like, I'm not so impulsive, so people enjoy being around me more too. So that part can be nice. I had a kid that I worked with that had anxiety diagnosis and had been treated for that for a long time. And he also presented as kind of a spectrum kid, had difficulty, like once middle school hit, failed everything, super smart kid, had no executive functioning skills and no motivation really, like, and so his parents are like, oh, he's just not motivated. And it's like, well, it's hard for him. Like, it's that whole idea of the executive functioning. He also had attention issues, and finally he's like, I feel like it's more my attention issues than it is my anxiety. And they put him on medication for ADHD, and he claimed for him it made a huge difference in just his ability, like his stress went down because he was able to then focus and complete tasks, where before he'd just get distracted all the time. So he'd be doing something and then it would take longer. And think how long it takes some of our kids to do stuff. Like, that's just frustrating for them, you know?
So does it affect and improves the short-term memory, which ADHD affects a lot, medication, and also,
Right.
you know, they are very bad at time management.
Right.
Does it give them better time management, which also can help?
I would say not always in either of those cases. It depends on the medication, but often you're just able to focus better, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean you might have better time management in the sense that I'm not quite as distracted as I was, but I can still be somebody who has bad time management, and medication isn't gonna help me, right? So it's learning strategies, the alarms, the things like that to help, yeah. Mhm.
At what age can we expect, or isn't it reasonable to expect that our kids can give us feedback on how the medication is helping?
I've had I think it depends on your own kid too, how insightful they are. I've had some kids who are really verbal, who will say things like, and the idea of a stimulant medication with ADHD is it has a paradoxical effect. So if you have a hyper kid, it's going to actually calm them down. Used to be, years ago, they would say, you know, give your kid some caffeine and see if they're more calm after the caffeine, because it's that same idea of the stimulant effect, right? So if you're a kid that's not going to respond in that way, you're bouncing off the wall with the caffeine. The trick is sugar makes you bounce off the wall too. So don't give them a soda with sugar. You have to make sure it's caffeine and no sugar, right? But I had kids early on that would say, I feel more revved up, or I feel sleepy, or I don't. The hardest one is a lot of kids will sometimes say, I don't feel myself, because they're used to being this really like energetic kid, and suddenly they're not. But it's sometimes just getting used to that too. Do you know what I mean? And I think a parent can see, is my kid being, are they happy? Are they not happy, right? And so there's a mood factor that kind of goes in with that too. Yeah.
So I went to the talk ADHD versus anxiety, and there was this discussion about medication, and the psychiatrist from here, I don't remember the gentleman's name.
Glenn Elliott?
Yeah. He was saying that it only treats the symptom, and it really does not affect the memory or function. Yeah. It's a three-legged stool where you have to do parent-teacher training, student training, and then medication may help, right, but it can go the opposite way. So don't think of medication. Right. The question I had was, if somebody has a diagnosis, I have an 8-year-old, then do you start with parent training and just therapy before you consider medication, or at what point, or how is it determined that there's an inflection point where
Right.
now something is necessary? Because our kid performs okay at school, but is he has sensory and high functioning autism.
I would say go with the sensory piece. I would tell everybody that. I feel like OT sensory diet is something that all kids can benefit from. It's kind of like when you think about things we do to relax, right? If you can think of things that self-soothe, you're helping give kids strategies to self-regulate and self-soothe, and that'll go a long way. And if they're still having a lot of difficulty after that intervention, then I usually will be like, okay, so let's, and I will do behavior with OT at the same time, but often they overlap, and so you kind of do it in conjunction. I think, especially with young kids, we always want to do medication as a last resort. You often get teachers, and I shouldn't say this, I'm giving teachers a bad rap, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to. But I've worked with a lot of teachers that are pushing for the parents, you know, your kid needs medication, your kid needs medication, there's no diagnosis. And that feels like it's more like, let's sedate your kid, right? And so I certainly have seen the benefits of medication, but I think, and I love Dr. Elliott, I work a lot with a lot of clients with him. He gives me all the ones that have more disruptive behavior. So that's why I have to smile. I'm like, Dr. Elliott, yeah, I get those behavior kids. But he's the first to say, like, you know, you want to be mindful as kids are developing. Like, these are young kids who still, their brains are developing. And we talk all the time about even the teen brain. The teen brain is still developing into kids' 20s. It doesn't mean that the medication they're on is going to hinder that, but it means that their brain is still forming. And so medication that works now may not work long term. There may have to be other trial and errors. And so it's hard. But I always say try the behavior piece first. If you're finding that they're really not able to do it, usually whoever is doing the parent work or the other will tell you if they're like, hey, I think he needs a little bit more. And the other thing I would tell you is usually it's a slower process that way. So it doesn't mean, hey, let's fast track this and get you on some meds and some training. But it takes longer sometimes for kids because you're really asking them to do a lot of taxing work. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I live in East Bay, and in the last few weeks I was trying to get some psychologists, neuropsychologists, or psychiatrists who can specialize on this in my area, and I found someone, but they are busy, especially psychiatrists.
Yeah.
They're not seeing new patients.
I know, psychiatrists are really hard to come by.
And, I haven't found any. The only option I have looks like them coming here in this clinic. Do you have a list of
If you call our care managers, they should give you a list of other resources, because we frequently, when we're full, give other resources. Sometimes people want to go through their insurance, so if it's PAMP or if it's you know, Blue Cross or Blue Shield, you'll have your own provider list. If people are open to anyone.
I go online and check with providers, they it doesn't tell me if they're, you know, specialized in or their experience in ADHD.
I've had people send me lists before, and I just run them by, like, Dr. Elliott's the head of our psychiatry here. I can't tell you how many times all of us in the staff will be like, hey, someone's got a provider list. Do you know anyone on this list? Do you recommend anyone? And so at least it's people that were like, oh yeah, they're good with this or they're good with that. And he in particular, he's got his own directory, Dr. Elliott does. And so I had someone in Pleasanton that was looking for a psychiatrist, and they gave me a couple names, and he looked them up and he's like, I'd recommend this one over this one. And so, you know, he's been around a long time and he specializes in ADHD. We do have openings right now for psychiatry though, and we have fellows. I don't know that Dr. Elliott does, but he supervises the fellows. And so if you see a fellow, you get Dr. Elliott because he supervises them, if that makes sense. So you still get his expertise.